I'm looking at ethical issues arising from the representations of warfare in film, from the 1970s to the contemporary era in the context of cultural and political impacts. I've examined different perspectives on a range of films representing different conflicts: Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Hacksaw Ridge, 1917 and Black Hawk Down. Representation means using language like signs, symbols and images to say something meaningful about the world to others. It's essential to the production and exchange of meaning within culture. Stuart Hall's seminal analysis uses the definition meaningfully representing something already holding meaning. He says representations don't have a fixed meaning. The creation and interpretation of meaning is dependent on different historical, political and cultural contexts between different individuals, groups and places. What's the significance of representation in war films? Well, most people haven't fought in wars. So Margaret Valentine says their experience and education of war lies entirely in representation, in how a film is produced and by whom, and how it's interpreted. Audiences presume considerable accuracy. Thus, she argues, authentic representation is essential lest a film be propagandic. Content and aesthetic communicate meaning through visual language. Valentine states war films often generate such unforgettable resonance in audiences who transform understood meaning into their own interpretations of war based on pre-existing beliefs. What causes war? Well, disputes over territory and resources, cultural, religious, political and economic disagreements due to ideological differences, and environmental disruption caused by different land use interests. And what's ethics? Well, it's an objective way of thinking, devoid of righteousness, i.e. it doesn't consider any specific stance as morally correct. Instead, multiple perspectives are considered and weighted. Ethics doesn't give one right answer, it gives several, some worse than others, and a decision is then made about an ethical issue or problem by picking from multiple least worst answers. There are numerous ethical issues stemming from the fact that war films represent cultural, economic, environmental and political conflict to global audiences. They risk reigniting or perpetuating cultural and political tensions surrounding war, influencing contemporary politics, perspectives and relations, potentially inspiring further disagreement or resentment. There's an argued responsibility to be historically accurate when dramatising war, since war is an eternal issue affecting contemporary individuals and cultures. War films can be educational if historically sound, but likewise be misleading if representing a manipulated account of events. War films can be propagandic, both accidentally and consciously, influencing audience perspectives potentially for political gain. So examining these three ethical issues in Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Brian Woodman believes this Vietnam epic is anti-war due to the insanity, violence and nihilism it represents. He says Coppola didn't seek textbook realism, instead encapsulating the war's grim psychological experience, supposedly to educate. In a scene where a helicopter napalm bombs a jungle, Coppola doesn't show the pilot. Valentine suggests this promotes war, with the dehumanised representation removing any guilt and responsibility from the killing act. Likewise, the consequent ground-level suffering isn't shown. The devastating human consequences of US intervention remain mostly unseen, promoting war. However, Valentine claims Coppola's removed spectator perspective from wide aerial shots realistically represents US napalm pilots who, high above their targets, psychologically protect themselves from consequence, and thus it educates through authenticity, supposedly. Coppola shot in the Philippines, believing it the most accurate alternative to Vietnam's environment. Keith Solomon suggests this risks reigniting cultural and political tensions between the US and the Philippines by perpetuating US imperialism in two ways. Firstly, by physically restaging the war with all its explosions, soldiers, vehicles, equipment and brutality, and secondly by doing this on Philippine territory conquered 75 years prior. Coppola himself recognised this mirrored the war's reality, refuting Woodman's anti-war claim. And countering Solomon, Philip Day argues this alleged perpetuation of imperialism was actually encouraged by the Philippine government for money. They let Coppola build and destroy whole villages and leased him military equipment like the US Huey helicopter model used in Vietnam. There was no resentment from the Philippines, and in fact the film has helped local tourist businesses thrive, so it didn't reignite tensions, supposedly. By closely representing the war's physical and psychological experience, Solomon agrees the film embodies enough authenticity to be educational. However, Solomon contends the film is subliminally pro-war propaganda through extensive special effects, which promote war as a technological marvel and fetishise scenes of destruction. Montage editing with quick jump cuts between helicopters and impressive formation and explosions leave audiences breathless and heighten drama and spectacle through technology. He says a character's response of outstanding mimics the audience, who forget the horror of war through dazzled awe elicited by the spectacle of sight and sound. Solomon says US injuries are horrific, like vivid mangled leg, which is represented like this to elicit sympathy. But by contrast, Vietnamese injuries are represented as entertainment. Their catapulted bodies from fetishized scenes of explosions are dehumanized, becoming mere stunts and effects. Furthermore, the Vietnamese are never heard. Solomon argues this diminishes Coppola's intent to represent war as hell, instead promoting war as exciting. Alternatively, Gerard Gilbert argues by representing the Vietnamese with callous indifference, Coppola did this deliberately, with a political agenda in mind, to promote an anti-war sentiment to US audiences by showing the barbarism war incites. However, this representation offended Vietnamese audiences, inspiring cultural resentment. Coppola himself says an anti-war film would not feature stirring scenes of helicopters attacking innocents. But Kevin Perry suggests Coppola tries to embody both pro and anti-war sentiments simultaneously to allow viewers their own opinion, yet the film is undeniably propagandic towards the pro-war US effort. Examining these ethical issues in Oliver Stone's Platoon, Marisha Struycken claims Vietnam veteran Oliver Stone's representation of war in Platoon was accorded the authenticity of survivor discourse, contrasting Coppola, who did not fight in the war. Milton Bates says Stone represented the war more intimately than Coppola, favouring close-up, tightly cropped images of ground-level suffering, violence, discrimination and confusion. While still filled with special effects, Michael Norman argues the closer, grotesque representation of consequence on both sides shows war as repulsive, rather than marvellous. Critics and veterans praised this realism. Stone's aim was to document the war, recreating its reality to educate people. His representation is taken by many as the typical soldier experience, which Norman suggests reignited troubling cultural and political tensions surrounding US soldier behaviour on the battlefield in Vietnam. For example, there's a sequence where the entire platoon, including the protagonist, partake nonchalantly in brutality and aggression towards innocents, even murdering and raping some. Norman believes the close-up, haunting representation in this scene perpetuates a propagandic, anti-war, anti-imperial sentiment, arguably contrasting or being similar to Coppola's fetishized explosive attack on innocents, yet with a different method. Distinctly, the screams and pleas of the Vietnamese are heard here, unlike in Apocalypse Now. Bates suggests this scene echoes the 1968 My Lai massacre of Vietnamese innocents by US forces, returning it to public consciousness and thus perpetuating cultural and political tensions and reigniting Vietnamese resent. Additionally, Norman believes Platoon is propagandic, like Apocalypse Now, but towards counterculture instead of militarism. It explored the internal struggle of US troop ethnicities, reflective of tensions back in the States. John Hellman notes soldiers arranged into two groups: juicers, who were borderline extremist patriots, and heads, who ironically embraced peace, hippie culture, and tolerance. Stone's semi-biographical protagonist becomes a head, sharing their anti-war sentiment, hedonism, racial tolerance, and counterculture. Their smoky den is invitingly candlelit, and they all dance to a culturally significant Motown recording. They throw arms around each other's shoulders, representing black and white Americans in a fraternal embrace. Helmer suggests heads were more receptive to other races than juicers, and by juxtaposition, the juicers' barracks lighting is harsh, and they drink whiskey, play with weapons, and make racist jokes. Junior, a black juicer, ridicules the country music being played against the backdrop of a Confederate flag. Milton suggests this iconic moment perpetuates cultural tensions by politically aligning the juicers with the slave states. This prejudiced atmosphere represents them as villains, stemming from Stone's own biased alignment with the heads. Helmer ultimately believes Stone's film is political propaganda, protesting against racial discrimination though. Milton praises this as good propaganda, anti-war and pro-diversity. He says if these represented messages are not interpreted as so, the fault lies partly with viewers who are unwilling to receive them. Examining these ethical issues in Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge, Elizabeth Flux argues war films tend to lack overt political commentary. Agreeing with Milton Bates, Flux says war films provide a catalyst for pre-existing audience opinions to be validated. Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge represents the true story of World War II combat medic Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector due to his strong Christian belief that life is sacred. While his ethos is honourable, if everyone took his position, then war would be futile. This contradiction is never explored because James Howard argues it would tilt the narrative too strongly towards a pro or anti-war stance. Most war films are seemingly pro and anti-war simultaneously, like Apocalypse Now, so the audience can identify and think about bigger issues for themselves. They have their pre-existing feelings and biases about war confirmed by what they choose to decode from representations. However, contrasting close-ups of corpse-eating maggots and screaming dismembered men in the film's first half, Andrew Todd labels the second half unashamed pro-war propaganda. US troops relentlessly shoot and machine gun and grenade the Japanese, who aren't shown suffering the same memorably gruesome fates as Americans. Their deaths are inconsequential by comparison, like Coppola's Vietnamese. Todd believes the Japanese are demonised, described with racial slurs and decreed as animals before audiences even see them. However, Howard suggests this is realistic to how the US viewed them in World War II. They are represented as grotesque, screaming maniacs displaying a relentless, merciless bloodlust, and their words are rarely heard, like in Apocalypse Now. Also, Emma Harrison believes Gibson fetishises their deaths, like Coppola does, with Gibson's camera showing slow-motion explosions and stylistically lingering over their ritualistic suicide. Ultimately, Harrison and Todd believe the film is pro-war propaganda. Chris Majeweski notes Gibson's eponymous ridge is represented as a larger, more dramatic peak than its real-world source, which Gibson never visited. He suggests such exaggeration in war films begs the question of what else is exaggerated, and potentially harms its educational potential. Examining the ethical issues in Mendes' 1917. Mendes' grandfather's war stories inspired representation in 1917. He shot and edited the film to appear as one long continuous shot, immersing audiences in the action like a soldier complicit in the violence. This makes the relentless tension and sheer horror of the battlefield feel more realistic and immersive than normal camera work would, promoting an anti-war sentiment according to Tatiana Siegel. However, Danny Lay argues this smooth, stylish camera work makes the battlefield sleek, fetishising and subliminally promoting the war by impressing audiences with unique cinematic achievement and immaculate choreography. All extras were hand-picked by Mendes to ensure they could move the right way. They then endured arms training to ensure every performance was authentic and accurate. Also, Lindsay Weinberg says their unique haircuts represented the reality that soldiers weren't allowed to have hair showing under their helmets. Using no wigs, every extra's hair was cut based on a different picture of a real World War I soldier, and this represents real men and thus embellishes historical accuracy. Siegel says this paid off, with the film's realism acclaimed. Carl Buchanan says Mendes made 1917 with a propagandic, anti-Brexit agenda, believing soldiers once fought hard for a unified Europe which Brexit will supposedly sacrifice. Examining the ethical issues in Scott's Black Hawk Down, and Scott's film presents itself as an educational reproduction of America's exit from Somalia after 18 soldiers died there in 1993, giving its representation great authority according to Richard Slotkin. Preparing to invade Iraq, Bush showed advisors and congressmen the film as propaganda to perpetuate his pro-war agenda. He suggested failure to persist and subsequent withdrawal encouraged 9/11 by displaying weakness. By contrast, Slotkin suggests many audiences interpreted the film as a graphic warning that foreign military intervention can become tragedy like Vietnam. Interestingly, Slotkin says there were only 2 black US soldiers in the film, a grossly disproportionate representation which offended some. However, Evan Thomas defends this, noting only 2 black soldiers fought in the real-world conflict, and the film's a reproduction of events. However, in one scene, one of these black soldiers freezes instead of shooting at a black Somali soldier running towards the platoon. A white soldier has to shoot instead, and interestingly, Slotkin states this scene was entirely invented for the movie and controversially represents the archaic, insensitive idea that black soldiers can't be trusted against black enemies, weaving this fiction into its non-fiction reproduction of events to embed it as truth in the public consciousness and perpetuate cultural tensions. Also, insurgent deaths are represented with propagandic indifference, like in Apocalypse Now and Hacksaw Ridge. Their overwhelming numbers are easily mowed down, whereas the less frequent deaths of US troops are represented vividly and viscerally. However, Thomas again defends this as authenticity, saying many of the Somali soldiers were untrained and unarmoured. Slotkin says there were lots of slow motion explosions and quick cuts in the film, like in Apocalypse Now and Hacksaw Ridge, subliminally fetishising the war. Ultimately, Slotkin finds the film embodies a propagandic pro-war agenda in both blatant and subliminal ways, but that this can be read either way depending on audience preconceptions. So this is a summary of how the debate has informed me as a practitioner and as a filmmaker. I like exploring realistic themes and settings, producing highly impactful, shocking films. They often feature violence or death, and like the films I've examined, but on a smaller scale. I've learned that overuse and over-dramatisation of atrocity with excessive gore and explosions often undercuts effective potential, like in Apocalypse Now, Hacksaw Ridge and Black Hawk Down. It fetishises scenes, reminding audiences they are watching a flashy, exciting film, and many critics see through this and label it accordingly. By contrast, when violence is modestly used and shown with close-up horrific realism, it's far more immersive and ultimately achieves critical success and audience engagement, like Platoon, for example. I've learnt less is more and closer is more effective, and I'll incorporate this into my own representations of violence to immerse rather than merely excite. I personally think an effective film makes you forget you're watching one, and I'll incorporate this ethos into my filmmaking. I'll also think more about how my representations may be interpreted by different groups and ethnicities, since I seek a global audience and don't wish to offend. I'll never follow the examples I've seen wherein the enemy is dehumanised and their deaths are shown as entertainment. I agree these are blatantly propagandic, like in Black Hawk Down, Hacksaw Ridge and Apocalypse Now, and personally I like to represent multiple perspectives as equally as possible to embellish realism, since humanity should be equal in representations of life and death. We are all human and we can all suffer the same. But this is my personal anti-war, anti-violent sentiment. I've learnt it's almost impossible to avoid incorporating one's bias into a film, but it is possible to be conscious of it. I'll discourage the violence I represent in my films by engrossingly repulsing viewers like Platoon rather than inadvertently exciting them. I've realised authenticity is essential to make audiences believe what they are seeing, and so I won't exaggerate locales like in Hacksaw Ridge. I love how the attention to detail in 1917 tremendously aids its realism, and I'll imbue my productions with extreme detail to create gripping visceral realities. I've also learnt stylish camera work is essential to engagement, but its purpose should always be intrinsic to the story and not just for show like in Hacksaw Ridge. 1917 is a great example of what I'll seek. Its defining and exciting one-shot style is crucial to the narrative. Ultimately, the perspectives I've examined for the debate and my own opinions on them have provided insight into what will help me create better and, well, arguably better films as a filmmaker. So to conclude, overall I've examined lots of perspectives on different ethical issues in war films. Many believe they attempt to be pro and anti-war at the same time, not delving into bigger issues, like political issues, to allow audiences their own interpretation. However, most agree that whether intentionally or not, they perpetuate a conscious or subconscious propagandic bias, whether personal or political. Their representations can directly influence politics and cultural tensions, which can encourage unity, resent, conflict or discrimination, depending on differing receptions from different individuals and cultures. Many have argued that the blending of fact and fiction in war films hurts their educational potential by promoting specific agendas. Because these films are mainly true to life, their inconspicuous elements of fiction are able to remain unquestioned and become accepted truths. Most agree that the representation of historical atrocities in war films shapes our world, but the jury is still out on whether this influence is good or bad. However, their potential to influence and educate is undenied, since they represent experiences of war to non-soldier audiences. Ultimately, like war itself, the definitive ethics of representation in war films will never be agreed upon fully, nor will their interpretations.